Imagine stepping off a creaking wooden ship in the year 1760, the salty wind whipping across your face as you gaze not at towering steel and glass skyscrapers, but at a low, bustling wooden town hugging the edge of a wild river where ships from London, Amsterdam, and the Caribbean crowd the docks, filling the air with the sense of tar, fish, tobacco, and wood smoke, while somewhere in the distance a church bell rings steadily. This is New York, not yet the empire city we know today, but already a restless, ambitious port where Dutch roots blended with English rule, where merchants dreamed boldly, and where the first quiet whispers of rebellion were beginning to stir among the people. By the 1760s, New York had grown into one of the most vibrant and divided cities in all of British North America. A crowded harbor shaped by trade, ambition, power, and the steadily rising tension that would soon erupt. Within a single generation, this very island would be scarred by revolution, occupied by armies, partially burned, and ultimately reborn as the beating heart of a brand new nation. In this video, I use modern AI tools to breathe life into historic paintings, maps, and engravings, shifting perspectives, changing camera angles, and allowing us to move through these scenes in ways the original artists could never have imagined. So the goal is not merely to look at the past, but to truly step into it, to walk the muddy streets of 1700s New York, hear the creak of carts rolling by, feel the energy of a city standing on the edge of something truly enormous. And if you stay with me until the end, we will compare these exact same locations to how they appear today, revealing what time has quietly erased and what has stubbornly endured through the centuries. Let us begin before the streets were called New York, back when this place was known as New Amsterdam. One of the earliest known images from around 1664 shows the settlement just as the English were preparing to take control, windmills turning slowly against the skyline. Fort Amsterdam squatting solidly at the tip of the island, with cannons pointed toward the sea, and rows of steep gabled wooden houses lining the waterfront in a pragmatic Dutch trading post built more for profit than for permanence. Imagine arriving here in the 1650s or 1660s amid a diverse mix of Dutch burghers, enslaved Africans, Walloons, Jews, and English traders, all speaking different languages while bargaining in guilders and beaver pelts, none of them yet realizing that this small, muddy outpost would one day grow into the financial capital of the entire world. In 1664, the English assumed control without a single shot fired, renaming the Fort James and the town New York after the Duke of York. Yet the streets, the gabled roofs, and even the canal that once ran down what we now call Broad Street retained much of their Dutch character, so the change was more in name than in daily substance at first, though already the settlement was shifting from a simple company town toward becoming the prized possession of a royal colony. By the early 18th century, around 1717, engravings showed the city expanding steadily outward, with a still low skyline pierced only by church steeples and the occasional windmill, while ships crowded both the East River and the Hudson, and the battery began forming as a defensive line along the water's edge. If you stood on the deck of an arriving vessel, you would see the city emerge through the haze, smoke curling upward from hundreds of chimneys, and the constant hum of activity carrying even across the water, proving this was no longer merely a trading post, but a genuine city already beginning to rival Boston and Philadelphia in ambition and importance. Trinity Church, first completed in 1698 and later rebuilt after devastating fires, rose as the most prominent Anglican landmark in Colonial New York, with its tall, steeple-dominating views across Lower Manhattan, where the elite gathered inside for worship while the poor and enslaved passed quietly by outside. Knowing what we now understand about the future, it feels almost strange to picture this church standing alone without the deep canyons of Wall Street surrounding it. Yet in 1750, you might have walked past its doors, hearing sermons that sometimes subtly questioned royal authority and sensing the growing tension between unwavering loyalty to the crown and the emerging sense of colonial pride among the people. By 1719, a residence had been constructed that would later become famous as France's Tavern, evolving in the 1760s into a central gathering place where merchants, sea captains, and politicians met regularly to discuss the issues of the day, and where, years later in 1783, George Washington would bid farewell to his officers after the long struggle for independence. Picture those candlelit rooms thick with tobacco smoke as arguments over stamp taxes and tea duties grew louder with each passing year. In spaces exactly like this, the revolution was not proclaimed in grand speeches, but whispered, debated, and carefully planned over tankards of ale long into the night. The building that served as New York City Hall during much of the 1700s stood proudly on Wall Street, where colonial assemblies convened and laws were debated. And it was near here in 1765 that the Stamp Act Congress assembled as one of the first unified acts of resistance across the colonies. We now recognize this site as the place where Washington took his presidential oath. But back then it functioned simply as the anxious civic heart of a city torn between deep-rooted loyalty and the swelling tide of rebellion. Laid out in 1733, Bowling Green became the oldest public park in New York, originally a place for genteel bowling and later a fashionable promenade for the wealthy, where in 1770 a lead statue of King George III was erected, only to be dramatically pulled down and melted into musket balls when revolution finally broke. Envision gentlemen in tricorn hats strolling leisurely along the paths, children playing nearby, while squads of British redcoats marched past in formation. A quiet green oasis in the midst of the city, yet already serving as an unintended stage for powerful symbolic acts of defiance. New York's entire fortune rested upon its magnificent harbor, where the Great Dock, built in the late 17th century, extended along what became Pearl Street with warehouses, counting houses, and bustling markets lining the water's edge as goods poured in from Europe. Sugar arrived from the West Indies, and tragically enslaved people were brought through these very wharves. Standing on that dock in 1770, you would have felt the unmistakable pulse of empire. The creak of ships, the shouts of merchants, the snap of ropes in the wind. But beneath it all simmered growing anger as taxes imposed without representation struck every incoming cargo and every hard-working colonist. At the foot of Maiden Lane, the fly market thrived as a chaotic, essential hub, selling fish, meat, produce, and virtually everything else needed for daily life, where women haggled fiercely, children darted underfoot, and sailors spent their hard-earned pay in an atmosphere of raw, unfiltered democracy where everyone from the governor's wife to the lowliest vendor crossed paths daily. Near City Hall Park stood the grim Provost Prison, known also as the Bridewell, which confined debtors, criminals, and later American prisoners during the British occupation in conditions so horrific that many never emerged alive. A stark reminder that even in a city that prided itself on liberty, power could be brutally unforgiving. Constructed in 1766, St. Paul's Chapel remains the only colonial-era church still standing in Lower Manhattan today. During the Revolution, it served British troops, and afterward hosted George Washington for a Thanksgiving service following his inauguration as president. Imagine its bells ringing clearly on a crisp morning in 1776, as the city stood on the brink of irreversible change. By the late 1760s, tension had reached a boiling point throughout New York. The Sons of Liberty gathered in taverns. Broadsides denounced Parliament openly. Crowds protested the Stamp Act and Quartering Act fiercely. And when British troops arrived, clashes became all but inevitable. In 1776, following Washington's retreat, much of the city burned, and the British occupied it until 1783, exacting a heavy price from New York. Yet the city endured and emerged far stronger than before. When the British finally evacuated in 1783, their ships sailed away as American troops marched in triumphantly, and Washington rode through streets filled with cheers, marking the beginning of an entirely new chapter. A temporary triumphal arch was erected in 1789 to welcome President Washington to the first capital of the United States, crafted from wood but finished to resemble enduring stone, while crowds lined the streets in celebration, proving that the revolution had not only succeeded, but had led to something solid and real. Now let us step forward into the present and see how these places have transformed over time. That famous 1664 view of New Amsterdam, with its windmills and Fort Amsterdam at the island's tip, now corresponds to Battery Park, where ferries still depart for the Statue of Liberty from almost the exact same shoreline. Though the fort itself has vanished, the island's fundamental outline endures. Early 18th century harbor scenes, crowded with docks, have been rebuilt many times over, yet the East River continues to flow, and Wall Street still begins where the old city once ended. Trinity Church's steeple continues to rise above Lower Manhattan, though now it is dwarfed by modern skyscrapers, while the oldest surviving sections have withstood fires and the passage of centuries. France's Tavern stands restored today as both a museum and a working restaurant where you can still dine and sense faint echoes of the farewell in 1783. Bowling Green remains the oldest park in New York City, with its 1771 fence still encircling the green. One of the very few physical relics from colonial times that has survived intact. The site of Old Federal Hall now holds the 1842 building where Washington was inaugurated, with its steps leading to the precise spot where colonists once gathered in protest. St. Paul's Chapel stands unchanged in form, offering quiet peace amid the frenzy of modern Manhattan, and serving once again as a sanctuary after the events of 9/11. The waterfront has been extended through centuries of landfill, pushing the shoreline outward by hundreds of feet, yet the harbor itself remains the undying heart of New York. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to 1700s New York. What started as a tiny Dutch trading post grew into the stage for some of the most dramatic moments in American history. If this resonated with you, and you would like to explore another city, perhaps Philadelphia in the 1770s, Charleston, Williamsburg, or even London during the same era, please leave your suggestions in the comments below, because your ideas truly shape what comes next. Until our next trip into the past, keep exploring history.